All right, after several attempts, we're back. It's COMP305, winter 2016, and it's week 8, part 1 of our broadcast. We just finished, well, 10 minutes ago, we just finished doing a review of exam 1, or the midterm exam, and we talked about a couple of nifty new things. One of the things we talked about, which I'll probably review again with you, is this idea of, and I'm bringing up the exam, but it doesn't matter, is find with tag, which we're going to talk about later on. So one of the things I talked about is using this, not script execution order. Let me see where it is. Here it is. This idea of finding a game object with a tag, which I'm going to talk about here in 3D. All right, so I don't need any of this stuff anymore, except for my live event. So I'm going to kind of click all these ones shut. I am going to create a new space on GitHub for my new project. I'm going to make a new project on GitHub under, of course, our Centennial College. I'm going to make a space for it right away. I'm going to make a new repository called COMP305, and it's going to be, again, I could have called it lesson 8, but really what I want to talk about is this 3D game, and I'll call it, it's winter 2016, and we'll make it like almost like this, my version of the 3D game demo, 3D game demo, right, that we're going to use over the next few weeks, all right, to get this done. All right, so I'm gonna use this repository as the place where it's going to be. And I'm going to call it the same thing here when I go to my Unity. So I'm going to make a new project. Let's click on New Project. My Unity project, I'll leave it as 3D this time. So this is something new we haven't done before. Well, we have, but not really at length. And I'm going to call this the same thing, COMP305, Winter 2016, 3D game demo, right? So it's not going to clash with anything else that's out there. Notice that I'm going to make a 3D thing. I'm not going to include any other assets at this time. I'm going to create project. Okay, once I've created my project, you know, I'm going to shut it down right away. Quit. And the reason for this is because I want to create a connection to GitHub right away. So I'm going to pull up my terminal window, and I'm going to CD to my desktop. And in my desktop, I have my Unity projects. And if I list them, I want to go to COMP305 Winter 2016, and it's going to be 3D, you know, or 3D game demo, right? This is what I want to see. Is it here? Did I make a mistake? COMP305. Where'd it go? Did I put it somewhere else? It happens. It happens. Where did I put it? No, I don't care about the weather, Tom. Did I put it in my COMP305? Where the bloody hell did I put it? Yeah, that's weird, man. That's strange-o-matic. Here it is. My platformer demo I did last time with you guys, so it's not in here. Guys, this is fantastic. Oh, here it is. No, it's not. Let's just do it again, right? Here, I'm just gonna, it's one of those days today. Developer hell is what it's called, right? When you don't know what you're doing, right? Let's see where this is pointing at. Users Thomas desktop. Oh, okay, we don't want to. That's what. So it's on the desktop already. That's why it's. I'm looking at the wrong place. Here it is. My winter 2016. I'm going to put that in the right place. Joop. Okay, let's try this again now by going back to Unity. So I'm going to. I should be able to see that now. So I'll say 3D game demo, right? And what I want to do is I want to say git init. And then git add dot git commit -m, and we'll say this, we'll call this initial commit. Right now, I want to grab those credentials that I got from GitHub, which is these last two things here for our remote, and we're going to add those into the remote here by copying those last two lines. There we go. So now we've got a basic empty project that I'm going to update every so often here on GitHub as we go. And this is the first iteration. This is our first commit, right? Okay, so cool. Let's launch that Unity stuff again. So I'm going to go back to Unity, which you probably have open somewhere. And I'm going to kind of, open. And I'm going to look at my, under Unity projects, which is our last object, this one, open. And that'll open up my Unity. Notice I'm using 5.33 Unity, so now I've updated finally, right? I've waited enough time, so it's okay to update now, right? I've got my my object here, and we're going to make a 3D game. But I don't want to work hard. And we did this last time together when we were making a 3D game for, who's got me for COMP392? Advanced Graphics. Remember we were doing this whole physics and everything else? Well, guess what? Physics are all here. Nothing to add in. It's ready to go. That's why this game is a single player or a single person game. You're going to make, this project isn't something you're going to share with somebody else. If I was to look at your COMP305 requirements for this game, going back to that for a second. So if I go to COMP305 and I go to assignment 3, this 3D game piece, again, notice that it's split over 3 weeks. The first week, this week, what I want from you is your game design document, a link to your GitHub repo, and your assets that you're going to use. So you should download your assets, as many as you can, by the end of this week to figure out what assets you're going to use for your game, right? They may not all be complete. Give me some basic assets. For example, if you're going to make walls or whatever for your game, that's cool. What is this thing? What are you going to make? Well, you're building a, you're going to follow the tutorials in class. I'm going to show you how to do. And you're going to make a first-person or third-person perspective kind of game. I recommend not to do a third-person. Please, if you try and do this on your own, third-person is way harder than doing a first-person game. First-person game, no body, right? It's just an empty capsule, right? Do you walk around with, right? Third-person perspective, you have a body and you got to figure out different mechanics, how to make this thing work, how it's going to follow you, how other enemy objects are going to hit you, a bunch of different things that are going to happen. I don't recommend this. This is way harder to do this one than it is to do this one. Okay, so unless you want to challenge yourself, don't do this. All right. The game must include enemies and hazards for the player to avoid and or destroy, a scoring system, and so on. There's a lot of leeway here. I haven't told you what to make. My recommendation is that you make something simple, like we talked about in COMP392. In fact, why don't you make the same game just with Unity? So what do I mean by that? Well, I want to make a maze type game. That's my first idea. I want to make a maze game. And I need some place where the character can go. But the first thing I'd like to try and do with our Unity is test the 3D character out. So I need a primitive object to test with that I'm going to call ground for now. All right? So let's do that. Let us get a primitive object. I'm going to go right-click, and I'm going to go new 3D object this time. It's the first time we've done this. And I'm going to create a new plane, right? There we go, plane, big plane. And I want to rename this plane ground, right? Let's actually add a material to the plane. And I notice I have my assets. I got to fix this all up too. I got to set up my project here, right? For the first time. Under my assets, I want to make some new folders. One of them is going to be underscore scripts, just like we did. Let's prepare this stuff, right? And we're going to make another one, another folder, underscore scenes. And let's make some other ones, another folder with materials. This is going to be a little different than the 2D game. We'll maybe make another folder called prefabs. We have a lot of those right in our game. And we also want to make another folder called textures. So we have maybe a separate textures folder, maybe some animations and so on. For now, this is probably a good start, materials, prefabs, and textures. In my materials folder, I want to make a new material, create a new material. And in my new material, notice that it's a standard material. This standard shader is what I want you to use from now on for today. And all we want to do here is we want to drag and drop a material, maybe that's something like, I don't know, brown or something. So I'm going to click in my albedo piece here and just choose a brown color between kind of like this, you know, this yellow and red color. You can also choose your values if you wanted to choose a brown that you're familiar with, right? I'm just going to choose a kind of a brownish color. There we go, that's a brown. And I'm going to call this thing, you know, ground. So my ground material. Cool. There's a couple ways to apply this material like we talked about before. One is I can take the material itself and I can drag it over here and press and just let go. That's one way. The other way to do it is to take my ground and drag it onto the scene and see if that works. It sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. I highly recommend, instead of doing it this way, this way, you do it this way, more control. So this way or this way, right? Okay, two different ways of dragging and dropping ground. I got my ground. Okay, cool. My ground comes with a couple things, right? Here's my mesh collider. It has a mesh collider on it. So it's got a collider built in. It doesn't have, this is a key, it does not have a rigid body at all, right? I'm not saying rigid body 2D anymore. 2D is out. There's no more 2D words in my vocabulary this second half. It's all 3D, right? So here's my rigid body. I don't have a rigid body here. If I put a rigid body in here, what's going to happen to the ground? It's going to fall. Let's try this out. So I'll put a rigid body. I'm going to go to physics. I'm going to put a rigid body on this ground. Here it is. And let's put it so that it's next to my collider, which I like to try and do that. So I'm going to move it up to my collider. And let's press play now and see what happens to the ground. Right? Does it fall? What happens? Ah, it's fall, right? It fell away. Yeah. So it fell away because my rigid body 2D, right, has been applied to it. I could limit it. I could put my constraint on. This is kind of weird. People do this too. I put my rigid body 2D on, but I want to limit it in some way. Like, for example, I want to freeze my rotation across the y-axis. There you go. And press play. See what happens now. So, okay, it fell anyway. All right. How about freeze my position across the y-axis? Okay, so freeze my position across y-axis. Okay, there it is. It's not moving, but this is really bad, right? Just saying. All right, we'll talk about this in a second. Other thing is the position of my camera. Here's my camera. This is what it sees. My camera, I have to move into position a little bit differently. Be cautious, right? Remember that the camera, you want to get the idea of what the camera is looking at. This is what my camera is looking at right now, right? I want to position my scene the same as what my camera looks at, right? So this is what my camera is looking at here. Remember that typically in all 3D software, the green arrow points to the y-axis, the blue arrow points to the z-axis, and the red arrow points to the x-axis, okay? Hint, hint, some questions on next test, right? Something like that. All right, so this is what my camera sees, and you know what? I want to raise my camera up so I see something different. Notice how I have my little preview here with what I'm seeing. So I'm seeing my camera from a very high view. If I run this thing again, there's my plane. Okay, let's add a box to the plane to see what happens from some simple physics. So I'm going to right-click here, and I'm going to add a 3D object, which is going to be a cube. And this is my player cube, and I want to move this to the center of my screen. As an example, let's take a look at what my camera sees right now. Oops. My camera sees right now. We'll make this the center of the screen here, center of the world. And hold on a second, we'll fix that in a second. There we go. I'll move this up by 1. There we go, here's my position. So it's move this up a little bit more. There's my my box, it's in the middle of my scene. And what does my camera see? It sees my box in the middle of the scene. Okay, cool. Let's add another asset in the materials. So a new material asset. So new material. Let's try that again. Lens flare. Yay, I love lens flares. New material object, right? New material. And I want to call this thing, we'll call this my player material, right? So my player material, yay. And what I want to do is I want to make this green because that's our typical colors for my player. Green color, right? Cool. And I'm going to drag and drop this onto my cube, which I'm going to rename player for now. Player, and I take my player object, my player material, and kind of put it on my cube. There it is. And how come it didn't? What the hell? How come? Round, flat. It'd be nice if I actually, chose a color. What happened? How come it's not happening? Right? Let's try that again. Green. There we go. Anyways, so there's our green player, and if I press play, notice that nothing happens. The player just hangs out there because it's missing a rigid body. No rigid body, no physics. All right, so let's go back. Let's go back to my player, and let's add a rigid body to him or her. We'll call it a her from now on, right? Because just to make it different. Right? So there's her player, right? Move up. There we go. And here's my rigid body, my box collider, and press play. And what happens? Oh man, how come it didn't collide with my object? Huh? How come? Well, here's my collider. Here's my ground. My collision is mesh collider. What if I use convex? If I turn convex on and I press play, does that do it? Not really. Kind of hovers there, right? Look at it. And let's take a look at what I mean by that. If I click on convex, right? Here's my mesh collider for my plane, right? And I click this on, right? My mesh plane, my convex. It draws what my collider will look like. Not cool. Right? I don't want that to happen, right? But I want a mesh collider. I want a collider for my plane. What other colliders can I put on my plane, by the way? And a box. But I'm having a problem. Like, should we have a problem like this? Right? Because if I go play, it's going to just go, fall forever, right? How about instead of a ground, just curious, right? Because we can make a ground look whatever we want. Guys, I'm pointing this out to you so you can understand, right? What about if I got rid of my rigid body 2D on my ground? Would that make a difference? Like, I don't want my rigid body anymore. Get rid of my rigid body, right? So let's get rid of them. So rigid body, bye-bye, remove it. And now let's try it and see what happens. Yeah, you know why? Because my ground's not going to move. So if my ground doesn't need to move, it doesn't need a rigid body. Any non-movable objects, ground, platforms, all this kind of stuff. You put a rigid body in play, you need a different kind of collider. My standard rigid body, my standard collider that comes with a plain mesh isn't sufficient. I have to add another collider, like a box collider, if I want to use a rigid body and something like let's say, for example, I want my ground when my block falls on it to spin. Like, you know, it's only going to be anchored in the middle somewhere, right? But not on the sides, right? So let's try that. So in order for me to do that, I'm going to put my rigid body back on, right? So physics, rigid body, here it is. I want to anchor it on the y-axis, but not on the z or the x, right? So I can spin around. And I want to take my cube, here's my player cube, and put it on one side, like over here. Yay, right? So now you can see that my cube, right, is kind of centered on the side. It's not centered in the middle. And if it falls on this thing, when I have a proper collider, and if I go to my ground, I want to get rid of my mesh collider. Let's get rid of that. Remove the component. And let's add in another kind of collider. Let's add in a physics, right, box collider, right? And where's my box collider? Let's take a look at this box collider, right? Like, how big is it? So if I edit my box collider, look how it hugs the object, right? So if I go, look how it kind of, you know, surrounds my object, right? So my object is here, kind of makes it so that Unity kind of tries to make it put around this whole object. Let's see if that works now. Box collider, and hey, what happened to the other side? How come we don't see the other? Oh, whoa! How come we don't see the other side of my ground? Huh? Oh, it's going to keep going forever, right? Well, let me show you that again. Notice how the cube is only on one side, and what I've done is, in my rigid body itself, I've only anchored my y. If I want to freeze everything, I got to go my x and my z too. But if I'm doing this, why do I even have a rigid body in the first place, right? Let's try this out. So, blah, blah. Hey, what happened, right? Well, I can freeze the position, but I need also to freeze the rotation, right? Now I've got a really big problem. I'm freezing everything. What the hell? Why would I do that? That's like constrain everything. Well, that means just don't have a rigid body, right? So that's what that happens. So curiously, I mean, you can certainly do this, you know, with your collision and all that stuff. Not a great idea that you want to try and do this. You want to kind of remove the rigid body if you don't need it on the ground, right? Also, when the object falls onto the ground, it imparts energy, right? Just like physics. It's just using physics. So it's imparting energy on the ground, this object, to spin around. So it's going to make this thing spin because I'm hitting it with my cube. My cube is weighing something, right? And it's hitting, right? Here's another thing I could do with my ground. I could put a rigid body in here, right? But my mass is 1. I can make my mass 0, right? I could do that with my ground too and take away these things. Let's see what happens when I do that. So I hit it, and then it falls forever, right? Okay, cool. And if I freeze the position or my rotation, let's freeze my rotation. So it's not going to rotate anymore, right? My position, who cares? But my rotation, oh, okay, that means I got to do the same thing now with all this stuff. Hold on a second. Oh, it went right through now. How come? Because I made it 0 mass. That's why. So you see that there's different ways of doing this thing, and making a mass of 1, not a great idea. If it's a ground plane, take away the rigid body, right? So go remove component, right? And then if I try this again now, well, see what's going to happen. Yay, right? My box collider works. Everything's good. And it doesn't matter. It's going to sit here. It's not going to affect my ground in any way. It's just basic physics. I wanted to show you that piece so you understand how that works. Okay, but my player doesn't have any motion, and we're playing a first-person controller, and we're doing Unity. I want it so I can drag and drop my stuff in, right? I don't want to code a single thing. And by the way, for your first-person controller, I'm not going to require you to code anything, all right? Why? It's too complex. Really is, right? So we're not going to get that to be done right now. So we're just going to take this ground off. Oh, sorry, my player gone. Player gone. I still have my player here, right? But what I want to do is I want to add a new asset that I don't have. So let's go to my assets. This is new. I'm going to go to import new asset or import package. Notice that on the right I have some standard packages. One of them is called characters. Let's go there, right? Characters. And it's going to ask me do I want to import all of this stuff? The answer is no. I don't want to import all this stuff because it's going to give me extra stuff. So under characters, notice that if I collapse some of these, right, that I got some other little things. I mean, I want my utility. I want my physics object materials. I want my cross-platform input that'll work across iOS and Android devices as well. I don't care for rollerball, so I'm going to just unclick that one. And I don't care for third-person character, and I'm going to unclick that one. Everything else I'm going to leave as is so that your scene will work properly. All right? And then click Import. It's going to do its little import dance, 2 seconds, and import your assets under Standard Assets. That's a really ugly place to put them, right? I want to differentiate my standard assets from my assets. So I'm going to rename this object here, or this folder. I'm going to rename. And again, there's different ways to do that. I'm just going to click and click again. And I'm going to put an underscore. Instead of just regular standard assets, I'm going to put an underscore, and it's redo it so that my standard assets appears right up here. So that way I can deal with my assets down here, but my standard assets are way up here, right? Under the scene, scripts, and standard assets. Okay, cool. If I go into my under standard assets, if I go into character, notice that I have in here, I have this character's first-person character. If I go in there, I've got my prefabs, and what I want to do is pull out this FPS controller and put it into my hierarchy. Yay, here's my FPS controller. Let's make this 0 out. So we're going to go starting in the middle of our game world. Now, caution. My FPS controller includes a camera, right? And I don't want to have a camera and another camera back here. I have 2 cameras in this case, right? So I can get rid of my main camera because my FPS controller has its own camera. So let's get rid of this camera here. Delete. Doop. Cool. Under my first-person controller, I have 2 objects. I have my almost what looks like I have a rigid body, right? And my rigid body has its own collider, right, built into it, just FYI, right? In my first-person camera, I have my camera itself and a transform and the first-person controller itself. Here's my first-person controller. My character controller is what I have in here, right, with my radius and all this other stuff. We're going to talk about that. A rigid body and an audio source. Ladies and gentlemen, please do not touch any of these settings at this time, right? We will touch them later. But for now, leave them alone. Right? Okay, cool. Let us do a couple things, though. I want to kind of rename my first-person controller into player and also change my tag name to say player. Good. I'm going to zoom into my player and use my control keys to kind of raise them up here for a second. Notice that if I look in there, right, very carefully, you can see what looks like an invisible capsule. Well, that's what the kind of character we're going to make. We're going to have the character is going to have a capsule collider built in. There it is. Look, see it? There's actually a capsule collider that's in here that's invisible. Here's something else. How about this one in here? First-person character. What's this? It's a camera, right? So let's rename that something that makes more sense, like player camera. So we know what it is. Here's my player camera. Here's my player. Okay, now let's play the game and see what happens. Oh, man. So I can walk. Oh, I can jump. Right? Huh? We're ready to go, right? Back in 392, we're not even there, right? Guys, this is all I need you to do for your first-person stuff. Your first-person controller, drag and drop them from your standard assets. Let's not waste too much time here. Remember, this is an intro course into game development, right? It's like kind of game. That's why it's called Game Programming 1. It's really Game Development 101. That's what we're doing here. So let's try this out. Let's press escape here, or stop. And we've got our little plane. Let's make our ground a little bigger. Right now our ground is like scale of 1, 1, 1. And I want to scale this out. There's a couple ways to do that. I could do it numerically, or I could, with my ground selected, I can go to this transform area and transform the ground so that it's bigger, right? So it's much bigger, so we have a little bit more room. And if you notice, these two things change, but not the Y, because ground doesn't have a Y component. Let's make this so that they're even. So 3 by 3, 3 by 3 by 1. And let's press play again and see what happens. So press play, and now we have our ground. We can walk around a little bit more. And look, there's a lighter area here. What's this lighter area? What is it? It's our light, which is right here, right? It's kind of reflecting in here. And I can go here, and if I go off the edge, right? I'm going off the edge. I'm going off the edge. What happened? I'm still on the edge. Oh, I don't see my ground anymore, and I'm falling. I'm falling forever and ever. I can't do anything. And notice that if I click away, so if I press escape and go over here to my player, look at my player is still falling. My Y position is over here. If I move this back to what it was before, so if I go to like Y is equal to 100, 100, there it is, and you see how fast it falls. Fast it falls crazy, right? So that's our player and our ground, right? Player and our ground. Pretty non-exciting though, right? Player, ground, non-exciting. We don't do anything here. But we have the elements of what we need to do. I have my player, which means I can collide with other objects, right? I could collide. I could create a collider. So when I touch another object with my player objects, it creates a collider. Do you see in my player right now, do you see a collider object in my player that I can hook into? Is there a collider? Well, let's test it out. Let's put in another block to see if my character, I'm going to pull him back here, and I'm going to put another object in my thing, and after this we'll stop. So I'm going to say another 3D object cube. Let's just put a cube in place here, and let's just make it so that, let's see if I can run into my cube. Okay, so I'm not even going to put a material on it. Let's see what happens. Oh man, let's try that again. Let's put a cube. We need to put a rigid body 2D, or rigid body, I mean. So I've got my box collider, but I need a rigid body, physics, right? Rigid body. I'm gonna leave it as is and press play. Okay, there we go. Can I run into my cube? Yeah, see, I've already got collisions going on, right? So do I need a collision? Do I need a collider? There's my cube, right? I don't need a collider. I have a collider, but I can't, I can try and push my cube around. Right, there it is. I'm pushing it to the edge. Ah, get out of here, cube. Right? So I could do that with my game, right? So 2 things to know with your player controller. I don't need a collider. I have one built in, and it's some kind of rigid collider. It's not a trigger collider. If I want a trigger collider, I have to add another one in here. I don't have one in. And by the way, my player is a prefab, which means it's made up of some custom components. One of them is this character controller, right, which is right here, which does things like this: my slope limit, my step offset, my skin width, my minimum move distance, a radius, a height, 1.8 meters. I'm pretty tall, eh? 1.8 meters, right? I can check to see if it's walking. I can vary my walk speed and my run speed, all this kind of stuff. I even have control over my mouse look and its sensitivity, and all kinds of other stuff I have that are all built in this custom controller, custom component that you cannot see, right? Do we have a rigid body? Absolutely. Is it here as a component? No, it's programmatic. It's procedural, right? So keep that in mind. We do have access to a collider here. If I want to trigger a collision, I have to add another on-trigger collider, right? Questions? This is the first part of our 3D world, right? Next day, we're going to make something in Blender, right? And we're going to import this thing from Blender into Unity, right? Because I want to make some kind of terrain for my character, right? Because right now, it's pretty boring, right? I mean, all it is a guy, he lands on the plane and doesn't do anything, yeah.
For the assignments, do you need to add the assets?
Yes. Yeah, you have to. This is one asset that you would add in. This is required. You need a first-person control. If you want to use your own, you can. If you want to download an asset from the asset store, in this particular case, like a first-person controller asset or a third-person controller asset, you could. I would allow that in this particular case. Okay. But I want them added in for Friday. Anything you're going to use. Okay, that's it for me. Let's get back on tomorrow, and we'll talk the next piece.